Well, today I get to talk to my pal David Forbes, the author of the awesome book, The Science of Why, which is really important to anybody who's in marketing, who's working with anybody, because it's all about decoding human motivation and transforming marketing strategy. So, human motivation, cool stuff. David Forbes, cool stuff. We're glad you're here. How are you, David?
Oh, I'm excellent. I'm excellent. Thanks for taking time.
Oh, heck yeah. Yeah, so excited to talk about this. So, this is such a fascinating time that we actually have science to back up probably what we intrinsically knew all the time. So, why now did you write The Science of Why?
Well, the quest for answers to motivational questions has been has been around for quite a long time, frankly. And I think the main contribution that I've made that's now captured in the book is to organize all of the scholarship on motivation into a model which is comprehensive. So we don't, Maslow talks about certain things, but he's very oriented in high achieving individuals. And Erickson likes to talk about identity, and McClellan likes to talk about achievement. And all of their work is very noteworthy. It's just I'm reminded of, I guess it was, are they called Swamis, the four blind Indian fellows who put
Yeah,
hands on the legs of the elephant. And so this is a picture of the whole elephant, if you will.
awesome.
And I did that really because in working with clients who have these motivational questions, why do people get what they get, and how can I persuade them to try me? It seemed very necessary to be able to give them an accounting of the full playing field of, well, here are the motivations that operate in your category overall, and gee, this product is fulfilling in this area against people who are motivated in this way, and here's another product over here that's working in this other space, fulfilling this kind of motivation, and here's the space that you seem to be operating in, and oh, by the way, here's some other space that doesn't seem to be very well fulfilled right now that you might take a look at. So I think it's kind of, if marketing consulting is all about helping people successfully take a journey, I like to think of it as kind of the full comprehensive map of the terrain on which the journey has to be taken.
Awesome. Yeah, I think so too. I mean, reading a book, that's certainly what comes to mind for me. It's way more comprehensive than anything I've seen. And before we go any further, I think it's important, David, let's qualify where this opinion comes from, right? You're not just some fly-by-night neuroscientist that started yesterday, right? You've got 30 years of experience. So take us through a little bit about that, because I think that's important, right? A lot of people call themselves like neuromarketers or whatever the heck they're calling, but please just qualify that for us so that we kind of understand where you're coming from, maybe a couple of the brands that you've worked with.
That's fair. And certainly the interface between the world of science and the world of
Yeah,
business
please do.
creates an awful lot of slippage, if you will,
Yeah,
for people pursuing business ends to sort of, adopt the mantle of science, maybe a little incorrectly, shall we
yeah.
say. Um, yeah, I actually began life as a scientist. I have a PhD in clinical psychology. Um, I was interested both in children's cognitive development and in the development of the art of persuasion, even in children back in the days, in the late 70s and early 80s. And at some point, I think around about 1983, I was actually working with a fellow. We were working on a book about children's play, and he was moonlighting for a marketing research firm in New York City. And I met him in New York because this was back in the days when publishers sent you back books with little green stickies on
Oh
the
boy.
pages. Doesn't this need a semicolon, or check this, citation? And we took turns. He would come to Boston and meet me, or he taught at Rockefeller, or I would go down and meet him, and it was my turn. So I met him at what he was that day. He was at work at this market research firm, and they were talking about why people collect stamps, working for the post office. And he said, "Gee, you should join in." And I immediately saw how thoroughly the skills and the skill sets and the concepts of psychology and clinical psychology could be applied to understanding all of the fullness of people's lives, which is in the end what marketers need to do.
Yeah.
And since then, I think I've worked for all the companies that have general in their name. Most of our clients um, are in the Fortune 100. We've worked in financial services, and when I say we've worked there, we work for companies like Bank of America and Schwab and um, Fidelity, and we've worked in packaged foods. And when I say that, we've worked for Kellogg's and Frito-Lay and companies of that ilk. And we've worked in pharmaceuticals, and there again, it's pretty much all the big ones. We work for Shearing, we've worked for Merck, we've worked for Bayer, we've worked for, Bristol Myers Squibb, really all of them. So I've been fortunate, really, to be able to get access to and be of service to kind of the leading companies in the U.S. and around the world.
Yeah. Good. Well, thank you for level setting. I just felt it was important to do that. When we talk about, all this stuff, there's a lot of charlatans out there, a lot of snake oil salespeople. So I just wanted to level set that because this book is really important to a lot of people. It is very comprehensive. And I think that understanding the motives and the motivations behind why people do what they do is really important. And you talk about 3 different motivations in your book. Can you talk a little bit about that for the folks that are watching or listening or reading this, please? You talk,
Sure.
yeah, the 3 motivations you talk about: the intrapsychic, the instrumental, and the interpersonal.
Categories of motivation.
3 categories. I'm sorry. Yes, 3 categories.
The matrix, the 3x3 matrix, which organizes what are really 9 motivational concepts.
There we go.
In the literature. And I didn't invent any of those, by the way. They're all
Nope.
out there. They have names like mastery and achievement and security and nurturance and identity and so forth. Those 3 domains of motivation, which is sort of the column part of the matrix, and it's one of the ways that they're organized, and also one of the ways that you can see how it is comprehensive, reflect sort of the answer to the question of if motivation is the search for change. One question you can ask is where? Where do you seek this change? And the columns intrapsychic, instrumental, and interpersonal describe the search for change in terms of how you think or feel about yourself. So that's motivation that in some sense is pointed inwardly. The search for change in the way that you interact with the material world around you, the stuff of life, if you will. And that's instrumental. And then interpersonal is motivations that focus on a search for change in the way that you connect with and relate to the people in your social life.
There we go.
That's sort of the organization that way. And the row organization, really, which is the other part of this 3x3 matrix, has to do with what kind of fulfillment you're looking for as you search for change in those 3 areas of your life, if you will. And the top row has to do with the search for change by way of expanding your expectations going forward, creating new possibilities, giving yourself the opportunity to do things differently than the way that you did, and do more things and more of them and do them better. The middle row of motivations pertains to those motives which are focused in the moment, in the real time. So it's enhancing your experience of life as you're living it, if you will. And the bottom row has to do with motivations to change the sort of evaluative retrospective you have when you look at the choices you've made and you look at how things have turned out and you decide how you feel about your lifestyle. And so when you talk about 3 distinct ways you can focus your motivational energy and 3 different kinds of fulfillment you can be looking for, that matrix then becomes arguably, because across you've really got inner focused and outer focused, social, and everything else. Going downward, you have future tense, present tense, and past tense, really. So there aren't any other tenses that I know
about. Camping tent. Oh wait, no, that's not a tense.
Pup tense.
There you go. Yeah, no, so that makes sense. So now let's walk through maybe a case study or an example that is one of your favorites that kind of illustrates why people do what they do or why we buy.
Sure. And just for fun, and when we're done, if you'd like, I can actually send you the deck that I'm about to take.
Oh, sure.
The sentiment analysis symposium next week, because it's got a number of cases in there that I kind of like. But one of the ones I talk about a lot is a client who was in the birdseed business. And I talk about this one because this was one of the ones that I think I was very surprised about the way this came out. And they were in a situation where, a not untypical situation, where the heavy users of their product were about 25% of their total marketplace, but represented about 75% of their volume. A not uncommon situation in packaged goods. And so they wanted to do a segmentation of those heavy users to figure out the why question. And we got 2 groups. One was slightly larger than the other. One was very much an expected group, and one was very much a surprise. And so the first group that we kind of went looking for and expected to find were the group whose motivations were dominated by belonging and nurturance. They wanted to sort of, if you will, build relationships with the birds,
Hmm.
and they talked about, recognizing birds that came around. They were interested in caring for the birds in a real substantive way. And we went on actually to talk about that segment with the client as a potential target for even sort of time of the year foods, so help them molt and help them lay their eggs and give them more calcium now, and almost let's be serious about treating them almost as if they were pets with whom you have a relationship.
Sure.
The second group, um, it really took me aback, but their motivations were mastery and achievement and empowerment.
Hmm.
And so we looked at all the rest of the data on these people. What became very clear is for them, the birds were decor. And
Oh.
they were interested in having a beautiful home with a perfect porch, and a perfect porch had a bird feeder with beautiful birds at it. So
Interesting.
for them, it wasn't about connecting personally with the birds. It was about attracting the birds so that they had the visual appeal of birds at a bird feeder.
Hmm.
So, and not surprisingly for them, we work with the client to think about birdseed products that looked good in their own right in the bird feeder, that attracted exotic and interesting birds, and that didn't make a mess on the ground under the feeder.
Huh.
So it was all about sort of the perfect householder homemaker motive, if you will, and it wasn't about connecting with the birds at all,
Huh.
which I thought was pretty fascinating. And
Yeah.
and the client was equally sort of taken aback by this, but came to understand how that could be the case, and recognized that people with whom they'd spoken over the years fit that mold, though they hadn't really been able to put a handle on it until they had this motivational frame to put around that perspective.
Yeah.
Another interesting case that I ran across some years ago, I was working for a client that makes furniture polish and furniture care products, and they were at that moment in time kind of under attack commercially by a product that called itself a dusting aid, and and the notion of that product was it just helps you get the dust off your furniture. It doesn't put anything on your furniture.
Ah.
And their attack, if you will, against my client's product was that it left an oily residue behind on the furniture, with the notion that why would you want to have an oily residue? Well, when we went out to people who were fairly involved in furniture care and used furniture care products with some kind of frequency at least, and what we discovered was there was a very big spike in their motivation in the nurturance area. And as we pursued that, it became clear that a lot of people, think about wood furniture as if it's still kind of alive.
Huh.
And so feeding, if you will, the wood furniture with oil was a part of taking care of it.
Huh.
And that you could have almost the equivalent of pet guilt if you neglected your furniture and found that it was drying out. So
Interesting.
that, of course, turned the tables on this competitor who talked about, not leaving anything behind, because that essentially meant you weren't feeding your furniture at all. We counseled this client to talk about ingredients in their product as being sort of cleansing conditioners. We basically told them
Hmm.
to adopt a sort of hair and skincare model
Oh. Okay.
as a way of talking about their product,
That's interesting.
based on the fact that people felt their tables were alive, though not moving.
That's interesting. So often motivation isn't something that's obvious until we discover it, would you say?
No, without a doubt. I mean, there are some that upon your discovery, you go, gee, okay, that makes sense. I would have expected that. There are others that after you discover it, you go, well, I wouldn't have expected that, but I guess that makes sense. And then there's the third category that makes you go kind of, wow, people are amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Wow, that is interesting. So, is this something that you have to be a scientist to take advantage of in your business, David?
You know, I'd like to think that what I put together in the Science of Why is a kind of handbook which would allow the sort of, you know, the involved user, the intelligent layperson, to think systematically about motivation. I think that, you know, getting people to tell you about their motives, or discovering what's going on motivationally in a particular situation isn't terribly easy, and you need, typically specialized tools to do that. And we have one that we call MindSight. That's an image-driven tool that we may want to talk about at some point. But however one approaches the learning process, just the fact of thinking about the problems by making reference to these 9 motives and what they're about and how they interact, I think will help people be more systematic at having a compelling product that fulfills on needs that are really out there, and being able to build a compelling promise in your communication so that people will resonate with what you're offering them at a deep motivational level.
Yeah, awesome. So yeah, you definitely segued right into my next thought, and that is let's talk about that tool, that MindSight tool, because tools for tools' sake are not important, but tools to get at what you want are critical. So let's talk about MindSight and how that works and how folks can get more about that, because I think that's equally or more so important than the book.
Sure, absolutely. And in this space, I'll have to say that you mentioned early on, and I was glad you said it, so I didn't have to, that there's a lot of as if kinds of players, if you will, in this space. And there are, frankly, a lot of as if kinds of tools that are, sort of in the right direction, but not really quite there. And I think that the beauty of this MindSight tool, and then I'll tell you about it after I finish talking about why it's so great, is that it's truly founded in a systematic analysis of motivation. So the categories you get when you use this measurement device, if you will, are deeply rooted in science, and as a result, highly actionable. And in fact, they kind of are woven into the fabric of our culture. And so, if I say, appeal to someone by, referencing their desire for a sense of mastery, I don't even have to give you advice. You know what that is.
Yep.
Anyway, the tool itself starts with the notion that there are a lot of reasons why people aren't always forthcoming about their emotions. Emotions are kind of by definition the more primitive parts of our mental functioning. People have talked about your lizard brain and all of those kinds of things. And as a result, they don't. If you're totally candid about the emotional dynamics that are behind your behavior, it doesn't always cast you in the best possible light.
No.
Because sometimes you're selfish, sometimes you're impulsive, sometimes you're greedy, sometimes you're all kinds of slightly unacceptable things in terms of the urges that drive you to make the choices you do.
Yes.
And secondarily, because a lot of motivation literally operates below the level of consciousness, and there's been a lot of work lately coming out that testifies to that fact. I think Ariely's work on Predictably Irrational is a good example of that. People can't tell you what motivates them even if they try, in many cases. So the MindSight tool is built on this wonderful nugget of neuroscience that a number of people have sort of put forth now in their work that has to do with what goes on in the brain when you show someone an image, which frankly I think is a microcosm of what goes on in the brain when you see something new in your environment.
Yeah.
So I think this can be understood as what probably needed to happen when man in the beginning turned a corner and saw something for the first time, while strolling through the jungle.
Yep.
Anyway, what happens is it takes you a tiny fraction of a second, maybe 100 milliseconds, not even always that much time, to recognize what you're seeing. And from that point, there ensues a period of 500 or 600 milliseconds, maybe up to about 800 milliseconds from the moment you saw it, that is purely activity in the emotional part of the brain. That's what's called emotional evaluation. How do I feel about this? And I think that makes sense evolutionarily, by the way, because I think probably the first thing you want to do when you see something new in your world as you're moving through it is to decide, should you run from it or can you eat it? All those kinds of important things. In any case, only after about 850 or so milliseconds, 900 milliseconds, do you see the activity in the brain of someone who's just been exposed to an image move from the limbic system, which is the seat of emotions in the brain, through the prefrontal cortex and into the frontal cortex, and you can safely conclude that they're thinking about whatever it is they see. So the MindSight tool starts with a set of images that we validated in advance to give you the feelings associated with fulfilling those 9 motives. So we have pictures that sort of evoke the sense of feeling masterful, or feeling secure, or feeling nurturant, and so on. We expose those images to people in that sub 1 second time frame, and basically create what I would call like, it's kind of like a sentence completion task. So, I might say to you, gee, I love being an interviewer and blogger because it makes me feel blank. And then I'd say, okay, now why don't we why don't we do this sentence completion task in which you're gonna be seeing a bunch of pictures and you're gonna complete that sentence. That's your sentence. I like interviewing authors and blogging because it makes me feel, you know. And now I'll show you a series of images very rapidly, and each of those images will give you a feeling. And if that feeling fits at the end of that sentence that you're working on, then touch your screen or hit a space bar. It's kind of device agnostic. And we then, expose the subject to 7 images from each of the 9 categories. That turns out to be the number at which the scores start to stabilize and all that good psychometric magic happens.
Yeah.
At which point, then, based on their choices, we have a pretty good sense of which of the motives are most resonant with them, because the pictures they get, there are scores assigned with each picture that have to do with that you picked it and how rapidly you picked it. And so the pictures, the categories of the 9 motives, which of the 9 motives have the most images picked most rapidly, will obviously get the largest score. And in a quantitative test, we then take those, profiles, imagine a graph with 9 bars, and work those against all the other questions we ask in a survey or whatever. In a qualitative setting, the moderator can actually see the bars displayed in front of him or her. And oh, by the way, there are positive and negative pictures. So if the topic is security, I'll spend 63 images, 1/9 of which are pictures that make you feel safe. But then I'll say, now let's look at the other side of it, and then I'll show you another 63 images, 1/9 of which are ones that make you feel scared.
Ah,
So we have both halves of that, if you will, the push and the pull of motivation,
sure.
trying to get the good things and stay away from the not so good things. Anyway, the moderator can look at that profile that's been created by each individual they speak with, and click on the bars, and then the images will open that are behind that, security score that was there. And we can continue to probe now with the conscious mind images that were surfaced by the preconscious emotional reactions to the images. And we're off to the races doing a deep dive into emotion that it's interesting how, you learn a lot from the images per se. You can then go on to learn a lot by probing those images, even though you're now in the conscious space, because they're iconic or emblematic of feelings that the person is now, they put them forth. So there's sort of no, they're typically more forthcoming about some of those, even if they are a little, non-idealized, if you will.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
that in a nutshell is Mindsight. It's an image-based tool. My patent lawyers circle around this whole discovery window of, the first 800 milliseconds post-exposure that no one had kind of, thought of before. And it jives with all this neuroscience work that's done by, hooking people up to serious. Usually it's been magnetoencephalography, if you can say that 5 times,
Ah,
which is a relative of fMRI, but it is better at indicating sequences of things. And obviously this is a sequence of events now, from recognition to emotional processing to cognitive processing. So, and Antonio Damasio is a fellow who writes in the neuroscience space, who I would recommend to you if you've not read him. He's very good at that sort of, at making things complex become accessible. He writes for the intelligent general reader about these things, and he summarizes. His book was out in 2010, so there's been a lot more research since then indicating that there is such a thing as this discovery window. But he talks in a very elegant and easy to understand way about this same phenomenon, about some of the first pieces of research that established this fact about how people's brains work.
fantastic. Fantastic. So if we were going to sum this up and take one idea that as a marketer or as a salesperson or as a leader, we could take about motivation behind the science of why, what would it be and how can we put that into play?
Sure. In order to have a real product success, you have to be working to fulfill the deep emotional strivings and frustrations of your consumer. And job one is to understand those before you even build your product. Because the reality is, in the end, the impression that's most indelible and that's most striking that a product will make the part of the memory which will be strongest and which will cause them to come back and back again is how it made them feel. So a motivational focus is paramount. And if in fact you adopt that perspective, then an organized, comprehensive map to the area of motivation to help you figure out where you should be landing with your product and how you should be talking about it is probably best found in The Science of Why.
Fantastic. So, David Forbes, thanks so much. The last question is a bunny here. How do we find, besides buying The Science of Why, what website should we go to, or should we find you on Twitter or LinkedIn? Where can we find more of your genius?
Sure. Thank you. And other stuff too besides genius, probably. You can go to thescienceofwhy.com. You can go to mindsighttechnologies.com. And you can also go to forbesconsulting.com. And any of those three sites will hook you into our stuff and get you attached to my blog and all the other stuff that we do in addition to talking about motivation.
That's awesome. Well, David, thank you so much for spending some time with us today. It was always insightful learning about The Science of Why and spending time with you. Thanks.
Thanks very much. It was my pleasure.